On today's Toy Spot, we're going to be starting, I'm excited, we're going to be starting my reviews of the Justice League / the Justice League Unlimited action figures. Today we're going to be looking at Superman, the Man of Steel. And if you ask me, this is probably going to be one of the hardest bunch of reviews that I'm ever going to be doing. Ever. And I don't know if you even can find Justice League reviews on YouTube, and there's probably a reason for it. It's probably one of the most complicated, convoluted toy line ever. And actually, Superman here, case in point, is a very good example. I figured before I actually did the reviews of all the other Justice League, I'd start with the initial cast. This is the initial Justice League release figures that actually included the figure stands, and I'll actually get into that in a second. But it's very hard to review something like the Justice League figures because, especially with Superman here, Superman has been released both singular and in the 3-pack carded figures numerous times. And while some have been repaints, Mattel, unfortunately, hasn't tried very hard and ultimately given us wave after wave of the exact same mold. It was the exact same mold. Superman has varied, but like I said, it's very hard to do reviews of the Justice League sets because while I'm sure many collectors out there know who have collected these guys, while many of those guys might know, many of you might not. And the problem is with most Justice League figures, especially with the 3-packs, in the past we've received usually one new character. And then with that one new character, they've thrown in a Superman, a Batman, a Wonder Woman, Hawkgirl, Green Lantern, and a Flash. So if you've collected Justice League figures like I have, you probably have about 200 Supermans. 200! I mean, I'm exaggerating, but you probably have quite a large number. But I figured I'd try my best to try to do this as informative as I can for how all over the place this toy line has been. But I figured I'd start right at the very beginning, start at the basics, and hopefully I can remember most of this stuff. But so what we have is the initial wave Superman, the very first wave Superman. The very first wave consisted of stands here, figure stands, as you can see. The Superman, the initial Superman at least, was a 5-point articulated figure. It had the articulated head, which mine is very stiff on this figure. It had the articulated arms, and it had the articulated legs. That's all you got, unfortunately, with this figure. Later released Superman figures, however, and I'll bring one in just to give you guys an example here, you'll see that there's slight differences in the paint for one thing, and slight paint differences in the paint. You'll see that the flesh here is much more flesh-colored than the initial Superman here. You'll also notice as well that they've slightly changed the hand on the original Superman figure. I guess the idea is they've opened both hands so that if you wanted to, they could pack it then with accessories. You'll notice that the original Superman actually didn't have that. The most notable difference between the original released Superman and what would then be the later released Superman is the additional 4 points of articulation. While this one only relied on the shoulders, the legs, and the head, the later released Superman had the additional elbow articulation as well as knee articulation. While I thought this was going to be an ongoing trend with later released Justice League figures, ultimately the additional articulation stopped with the Aquaman. The Aquaman was actually the last figure, from what I can remember, to have the additional 4 points of articulation. What they ended up going back to, the 5 points of articulation. As well, with the 5-point or the additional 4-point articulated Justice League figures, what they ended up doing, and if you have Justice League sets out now that you pick up, you'll notice that the additional 4-point articulated Superman, for example, is no longer. What they're now swapping back into the sets are the 5-point articulated Supermans. They probably realized that, for one thing, it was a lot easier to swap in the easier mold that's got the less articulation. Plus, as well, consistency-wise, the other Justice League figures that these were packed with only had the 5 points of articulation, so they probably thought, well, we're not going to include the Superman with the additional points of articulation. We'll leave them out and we'll just put in the original. Everybody's staying with me so far? One other problem too that they had, I think, with the additional articulation, earlier wave Supermans, and I'll see if I can try to do reviews of them as well, earlier waves had predominant pegs. You could see more predominant pegs in both the knees and as well as the elbows. It wasn't as very... I think this is a later release Superman, which, as you can see, the pegs are there, but I believe the original 5 or additional articulated Supermans and Batmans and everything else tend to have longer pegs. You could actually make them out a little bit more than what on these guys here. I think I like the 5-point articulated figures better. While I do like these guys, the downside to them is that the joints are extremely obvious. As you can see on the Superman and everything else, extremely obvious indeed. The other downside to it is, like I said earlier, with the figures that had less articulation, and then to have these guys with it, it just didn't really make much sense. So I'm almost thinking I'd like to go back and just have these guys on display rather than these ones here. As you can see as well, his legs are more out as well. This also led to problems with the legs being warped. A lot of legs got warped and very loose, I might add. My Flash, most of his legs are very loose on these figures just because of this additional articulation here. Moving aside, however, going back to the original release of Superman, as you can see as well, he is much paler in complexion here. Much more paler. Detailing is pretty nice, pretty standard. I mean, in fact, when you first picked up these sets, you probably liked the figures quite a bit, but you're probably now at the point, if you've still collected them straight through, you're probably very tired of looking at a Superman figure and Batman and so on. One other problem with the Justice League figures, unfortunately, is if you collected Batman animated series figures or Superman animated series figures, the Justice League figures were actually shorter. They were quite a bit shorter than the other figures. Unfortunately, that meant, scale-wise, they were completely out of scale. And I would have liked that Mattel had actually kept them at the same relative height so that it was consistent with the other figure lines. There's nothing worse than having Superman here standing next to an animated Catwoman, and Catwoman's about the same height as Superman. Just doesn't make much sense. Going back though to the original wave, and you'll see this is why it's so hard to review the Justice League figures. The initial wave Superman came with no accessories. As you can see, he wouldn't really be able to hold them anyways. The one thing he did include though was he came with a stand. And the good thing about the stand is if you've bagged these away like I have, and you're not quite sure which figure went with which stand, you'll notice though that there's a Superman emblem, and that actually carries over for the entire standee setup. And actually, when I finish reviewing all of these figures, I'll put the stand together and you guys can see all of them together. One other thing that he does come with, and this actually is consistent with all the other initial release figures too, is that they come with a figure card. A figure card right there that shows the cast of the initial Justice League lineup. On the back though, there is a motion card here of Superman. I think you can see there. And the idea is you can actually peg that stand at the very back, or that card at the very back of the stand. So far it says LE. Anyone want to guess where this is going? But you take your Superman figure, you can actually peg it. He's got two pegs underneath here, and you can peg him into his stand. Yes, not very exciting, I suppose, but it looks a little more impressive when you have the other figures in the initial lineup and you can actually put them all together. I will, like I said, be doing the review of them, trying my very hardest to be as informative, like I said, as I can. But this line is very gray and very hard to review. Like I said, very hard to review. Basic figures, yes, and while it might not be everyone's cup of tea, one drawback to the figures of these lines is the fact that they've reused these molds countless times. So while you may not necessarily have a Superman figure, you most likely might have a figure that's used the exact same mold, whether it be a Captain Atom. I think OMAC used the mold as well. I mean, there's been several of them. But yeah, so there you go. Like I said, for those actually interested in this, what I'll do is I'll try to do a full review, a full detailed review on all the figures, and then as we get to the later sets, you'll see how things get a little grayer. But in the meantime, that was a toy spot on the first wave, Justice League First Wave. This was the Superman with stand. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys are still asleep. Oh man. And I'll see you guys next time for another toy spot. Later.